Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Today we will continue with recording the material of the course M256, and our recording today will cover Unit 2 Requirements Specification. Requirement specifications is the first phase of software development process, and in this phase we carry out two activities. The first one is eliciting the requirements, which means we collect the requirements from the stakeholders, clients, and possible future users. After collecting these requirements, we analyze the requirements to produce the specifications. Of course, this phase is very important, and in this phase we will decide what the system will be doing and what are the functionalities of the system based on the stakeholders' requirements. Of course, any mistake in this phase will produce big problems in the future, because all the other phases coming after the requirement specification will be based on the requirement specifications. So the mistake at this phase will cause more mistakes at the coming phases, and if we make serious mistakes at this phase, we may have the risk that our whole project will fail. First, let's have a look at the aims of this unit, Unit 2. We introduce you to the activities in this phase, which are the requirement elicitation and requirement analysis. The delivery of this phase will be in what we call requirements document. So we'll have a look at the process of producing this document, and you will be also allowed to practice this phase, requirements specification, with two examples, one involving a hospital system and another one involving online shopping system. So before the software development company can start creating the software system, there are two people who are involved in a very important stage, which is requirement elicitation, and those two people are the business analyst and the system analyst. The business analyst is the person who understands the business system within the organization. So he is one from the organization itself who understands exactly how things are done within the organization. From the other side, from the software development company or site, the system analyst will be involved in this stage, and the system analyst is the one who can understand and map the business requirements to some software requirements. As we mentioned earlier, this process is called requirements specification, and it will be produced as specifications in a document called requirements document. And one of the definition of requirements document is the specification of the requirements of the system produced after negotiation between the client and the analyst. And in this particular phase, the client is what we earlier called business analyst. And during this phase, more people can be also involved, like future users and what we call stakeholders. And a stakeholder is anyone who has an interest in the system. It may include clients, future users, analysts, and developers. So everyone involved in the development of the system, from the organization side or from the software engineering company, can be involved or may be involved in this particular phase. That's to produce the best possible requirements specification and to avoid making mistakes at this stage. Because as we mentioned earlier, mistakes at this stage will cause worse situation, worse mistakes in the coming phases. Now we will discuss the skills that the system analyst should have to be able to handle this very important job at this very important phase. The system analyst should be having interviewing skills and listening skills. Means he can ask the right questions to the right people and can listen and able to understand from what he listens from what he heard that this information can be used in the right way. He has good interpersonal skills, so he can negotiate conflicts and can decide about priorities of information. Should be able to observe and use his observations to improve the requirement specifications and to improve good understanding with the stakeholders. As he's going to collect a lot of information and meet a lot of people, he should be able to organize all this information in the right way. He should be able to evaluate the information gathered critically, so he can use it to go deeper with the stakeholders and get more information. We need to remember that the view we have as software engineers is different from the view the normal people or the organizational people has or have. Okay, so the system analyst should be able to map the business ideas to software development ideas. You should be able to abstract detailed information to take the big picture view of the information, because that's our concern. We cannot go with the client in the simple details and ignore the big picture. So the ability to abstract information is very important skill for system analyst. Of course, he's going to communicate with different kind of people and use different kind of means of communication. So he should be able to deal with the different levels of users and use different kind of communication methods. Now, how do we collect information? Basically, we are dealing with stakeholders, and normally they are human. So one of the best ways is to ask them a lot of the questions. So asking questions is one of the most important methods of collecting data and eliciting requirements. These questions can come in the form of questionnaires or surveys or discussions or interviews. So we can ask questions and get more information, and based on the answers, especially in the interviews, we can ask more questions to get to know all the users and the client's requirements. We can also observe the users when they are using related systems or prototypes of our system, and we can record our observations and make use of those observations. There are also documentation for some existing systems or good practices in this field, the field of our system, so we can refer to these existing documentations and existing processes. Sometimes the client may find it hard to understand what we are saying, so what we do, we produce some prototype of the system so they can use it, they can see it, and then we can get more information and we can get their opinions on the system through its prototype. And the prototype is a demonstration system constructed so that the stakeholders can visualize the system or part of it. And basically, the prototype will normally visualize the interface of the system and some simple functionalities so that the client and the stakeholders can use the system and give us their feedback. Collecting information is an iterative process. It doesn't go in one round. We need sometimes to go back to the different stakeholders and ask them more questions. Why to ask more questions? Because sometimes we have two different opinions from two different stakeholders. So we can make things clearer by asking more questions. And sometimes we have priorities, so we need to be sure of the priorities by asking more questions and be sure that we are doing the first things first. And as I mentioned before, interviews is a very good way to deeply understand the client views and opinions, and this is a very important skill that system analysts should master. It's very important when you interview or talk to stakeholders to use their own language. So in the education field, they have their own language that they use in this field, where they have different language in the medical field. So we need to use the stakeholders' language when you communicate with them. We cannot use the jargon common in IT. You need to use the common language of the business area. This will reduce the misunderstanding between you as system analyst and the people in the business area and the stakeholders. Normally, we ask about the general scope of the system so that we can determine the breadth of the services that the system should or expected to provide. Once we have understood the scope of the system and we determine that, we may start to know more about the behavioral requirements, because the behavioral requirements is the clear thing, the very clear thing for the stakeholders and the people in the business area. Behavioral requirements are specific tasks that the system being developed must be able to do. So from the view of the client, we need to know what they expect the system to do for them. And this is a very good and important way to start to understand the business area people view or the client view. When we know what basically the client wants from the system, we can start to go deeper and understand more about their requirements. And from this point, we can start to understand each other. We may take these behavioral requirements one by one and go in detail with this particular requirement. Now, during collecting the information, the analyst should be able to clarify and understand what exactly the requirement is. So he needs to filter the information and get to know exactly what is the requirement while doing the process of collecting information. So by asking more questions, meeting more people, clarifying their ideas, the requirement can be formed out. And this process is called requirements analysis. After the requirement is very clear for the system analyst, it needs to be put and concise in some clear English, unambiguous and clear for client and for analyst. This form of the requirement is called use case. It specifies what is the functionality or the requirement is, and having it with the right level of details is very important for the rest of the development phases. So at this level, we produce use cases of the system. Means what are the uses of the system according to the client, stakeholders' opinions and needs, written in clear English language with enough details to continue with the development and using it with the development. For example, if we take this particular statement, which describes one aspect of a behavior required of a new system, it says the system should provide financial information for the company accountant. When you say financial information, we don't know what kind of financial information need to be provided. So what to do? We have to go further with requirements elicitation meet more people and ask them exactly what do they mean by financial information. And as a result, you may have the new requirement in the statement: the system should display the total receipts for a given day. The system should display the total profits broken down by department for a given year. If you look at the new statement, it has clearer aims, clearer information, detailed information, and now we understand what kind of financial information we need to provide. And since there are two different things, two different behaviors, we can write them in two different use cases, and it's advisable and important that you find a good name for your use case. And normally it starts with verb because it's use and a function, a behavior, so it's a verb. So for the first statement, the system should display the total receipts for a given day. We called it list receipts. And the second one, the system should display the total profits broken down by the department for a given year. We called it list profits. Then we describe this use case. So the list receipts, the administrator identifies a day. The system displays the total receipts for that day. So we show the stages in this use case. In the second use case, the administrator identifies a year. Then for each department, the system displays the name of the department and the profit made by that department in that given year. So now we are clear about what the behavior will perform or what the use case will perform by describing it with the right detailed information and the right level of information. Now, after producing use cases for the system, so the system analyst will produce from all these questions asked and answer got from the stakeholders a list of use cases. And we saw two examples of list cases in the previous slide. So these use cases will be now collected in what we call requirements document. And that document will provide both the client and the software developers with a clear and unambiguous understanding of what the tasks on the new task software system is expected to perform. It may also include some limitations on the software development. Now, this document is very important because it will be the reference for the other phases developers. And it will be the base on which the rest of the project will proceed. So, building an ambiguous, well-documented requirements will be very helpful for the developers in the other phases. It will be the reference for these developers, and it will be the base for the rest of the project process. Now, after we approve this requirements document, so both the client and the software developers are happy about the content of this development, it often signed as legal contract. And this contract will define what the client has agreed and what the software developer will produce. based on this contract, the client cannot ask different things from what agreed, and also the software developers cannot produce different things from what agreed. So it will be a legal contract between them, and both should accept whatever comes and agreed on this contract. Now, the requirement document, as we mentioned earlier, is very important. It must be very clear for both client and software developers, but in general there is no particular format or no one agreed format on how the requirement document will look like. But we all agree that this document should include 3 important items or sections. The first one is the system domain. System domain is a brief description of the part of the business within which the new software system will operate. Also, the requirement document should include behavioral requirements. And in previous slides, we show how these behavioral requirements are formed. We said it will be formed in a form of use cases, and you can see examples of use cases in the previous slides. So the list of use cases in the requirement document will represent the behavioral requirements of the system. It may also include some limitations on these behaviors. Also in the document for requirements, we should include what we call acceptance tests. And these are the tests to be performed to ensure the client that all the agreed behavior is provided by the completed system. The coming slides we will elaborate on these components or sections of the requirement document. System domain is a section in the requirement document, contains a brief description of the part of the real world within which the proposed system will operate. So after we produce the system, it will be put in some real world place. Could be a hospital, school, a house. So the system domain will describe that part of the real world where the system will be working. And in the system domain, we have only information that's written, the information that's within the scope of the new system. So it doesn't talk about the behavior of the system itself, but it will just show the scope where the new system will be installed and will be running. Now a very important section for the software developers is the use cases, or what we call the real behavioral requirements. And these are the base for the coming phases of software development, and they define what the completed system will do. And they will form the base for the new or the coming phases of the system. Acceptance tests is a very important aspect of software development. Acceptance tests are not performed at this level only, we may perform acceptance tests at other software development phases and throughout the whole process of software development. The aim of the acceptance test or acceptance testing is to convince the client that the system works as specified. So we produce an acceptance testing, and succeeding in this acceptance testing will convince the user that the system will be working the way agreed in the requirement document contract. If the acceptance test failed, then we need to change in the behavior. We need to ask more questions why the acceptance test didn't pass. And when we ask more questions, we understand the situation better. We produce a new acceptance test and ensure that it succeeds. The client may not accept the final product if he is not convinced through the acceptance testing that the system will be working correctly at the end. So what we do, we produce one or more acceptance tests for every and each use case and ensure that these acceptance tests will succeed and pass. As example, we consider the use case list loans in the library system. So in the library system, the use case list loans is defined as the following. The librarian identifies the borrower. The system displays a list of the books which that borrower currently has on loan and indicates any that are overdue. So this is a description of the list loans use case. We need to know who is the borrower, what books he has on loan, and out of these books on loan, what books are overdue. This is the use case. So now we provide some acceptance tests, okay, to ensure that this use case is implemented the right way as described. So example of acceptance test that we may use, we need to test that the list is produced correctly. If the borrower has no books on loan. So we take the absolute situations. One of the absolute situations that we have a borrower, but that borrower has no books in loan. Can the system produce this list? Which means an empty list of loans for the borrower. And now we take another situation where the borrower is having some books on loan. So we need to test that the list is produced correctly if the borrower has books on loan and there are no overdue books. Then we again test whether we can produce the list of loans when some books are overdue. So we take all possible situations. The borrower has no books on loan. The borrower has books on loan but no books are overdue. And the other possible situation, the borrower has list of loans and some of these books are overdue. So if you want to test any device, you put it in a hard situations. You put it in absolutely hard situation to pass, and that's what we have done in this situation. We try to test all possible cases, and if the use case passed these tests, then we will be able to ensure that this particular behavior will be implemented correctly in our system. Another component of the requirement document, which is a very important component, is the constraints. A constraint is a limitation on the system or its development. So the client may put some limitations on the development of the system. They may ask for some particular thing that needs to be followed. This constraint can be on the performance of the system. It can be on the environment of the system or in any aspect of the system. So we need to have a list of the constraints that need to be fulfilled. As you can see in this slide, we have some examples of requirements. For example, if I want the system to run on some particular operating system, this is a constraint. This is a limitation. Many of the limitations and constraints will be non-functional, means they will be quality constraints. The client may ask for some particular qualities in the system, and the software developers should be able to meet these constraints and these requirements from the client side. Now, analysts must be smart enough to distinguish between what's a behavioral requirement and what's a constraint. A behavioral requirement is some functionality that needs to be implemented in the system, that system must be able to do, where the limitation or the constraint is a limitation on that behavior. In this exercise, we'll have a look at some of the requirements to find whether they are behavioral requirements or constraints. For example, if we take the first example, the system should periodically update the artifacts position file. This is a behavioral requirement because the system will do some particular function. It will update some particular files. So it's a behavioral requirement. The second, B, the response time of the scan command should be no more than 0.2 milliseconds. So there is no functionality in this particular requirement. It's a limitation considering time. So no functionality, but a limitation considering some particular aspect of the development. And in this case, it's time, so it's a constraint. The flight coordinates should be held in a sorted collection. No functionality, but a form of how things should be done, a constraint. An object-oriented programming language should be used. Nothing about the functionality of the system, it's about the environment of the system development and the language that will be used in that environment. Where the last one, when given an aircraft identification number, the system must display the aircraft's position. So the system should do something which is displaying the aircraft's position, and this is a functionality and this is a behavioral requirement. If he give us he asked if the system, the client, if the client asks us for some particular form of display, then it will be a constraint. But the display itself is a function and a behavioral requirement. Now, as example of documentation of requirement documentation, we will have a look at the hospital system. And as we mentioned earlier, we should be able to produce system domain, list of use cases, and list of acceptance tests for every and each use case. So we start by producing an initial description of the hospital system, then we will go with the analysis phases. Here is an initial description of the hospital system. And this is a general description of what the system should do, who are the entities active in this system. This particular document will not be helpful to produce the requirement or the document's requirement. We need to ask more questions. We need to interview peoples mentioned and named in this particular description to understand the system better, to understand the behaviors of the system, to understand the domain of the system, and to be able to produce acceptance tests for the system's behaviors, to identify the constraints in the system. So in the following 2 slides, you find an interview between the analyst and the area of the expert in the area. So the analyst will represent the software development organization, and the hospital administrator is representing the hospital. So there will be more question and answer and better understanding from the analyst side to the system, and based on this understanding the documents, the requirements document will be produced. The analyst will not meet only one particular person or interview one person. They may need to interview more people in the organization to be able to produce the needed document. So now, after performing the interviews and after building a good understanding of the system, the system analyst will produce the specification document, which will include, as we mentioned earlier, the system domain, the list of use cases and their constraints, and also the acceptance tests. As you can see now, the system domain is described in a detailed way, and as a student you need to read it carefully and try to identify the basic functions from this description of the system domain. In the exam, you may need to read and identify use cases from such a system domain. So if I go with you with some of the facts and requirements given in this system domain, I read in the hospital there are a number of words. So you know that now the system has number of words, and each of which may be empty or have on it one or more patients. So if, for example, if I want to have a use case called list patients, and I want to build a test case and acceptance test case for this use case, then I need to be sure that I can have a list of empty patients in the ward, or some patients on the ward, or a ward which is full of patients. Then I continue with the system domain. There are 2 types of words. So I know there are a number of words, and they are divided into 2 categories: male words and female words. A word can only have patients of the specified sex on it. Means you find only males in the male ward and females in the female ward. If any acceptance test fail to identify the males ward from the female wards, then it will be an error and need to be fixed. Now every ward has a fixed capacity, means there are number of patients or number of beds in every particular ward. Now if you continue with reading this system domain in details and with a high focus and high concentration on the content, you will be able to understand the system very well, and you will be able to produce the use cases. Now the use cases produced, and you should be able to produce them if you read the system domain carefully, are listed in your text book, your booklet for Unit 2, and some of them are given in this presentation and the coming slides. For example, one of the use cases determined is admit patient. So as we mentioned earlier, we need to give and put this use case and every use case in a very good, clear English language with the right amount of details and information. So admit patient, what we have in this use case, the administrator provides the system with the patient's name. So you need the patient name to start to perform this use case, and also its gender or sex and date of birth, and identifies the team that cares for the patient. Now, based on this information, the system will identify the right word for this patient, because we have male and female, and we have wards that are full, so I have to look for a place for this patient. If there is a choice of such ward, one of those with the largest number of empty beds is chosen. So if you have two wards that the user can go in, we choose the one that has less patients and more empty beds. If we can find a place, we can find the right word for the patient, then we should be able to inform the administrator so they can take some action. So we go on with the other use cases, and in the class your lecturer will go in details with these use cases, and also you may yourself learn from this very good example and very detailed example of how to produce the system domain from the interviews, and now how to produce the use cases from the system domain and the information in the interviews. We have more use cases: treat patient, discharge patient, transfer patient, and they are all given in a very good and clear language. Now, after we identify all the use cases, we need to build the acceptance test for these use cases. So, for example, we label the use cases with A, B, C, D with the alphabets, and in the acceptance testing, you find that there is a list of acceptance tests for A, which is admit patient, B, which is treat patient, C, which is discharge patient, and so on. So now the test cases, the acceptance test is for A. Test that when there is no an appropriate word available. So we want to check if we cannot find the right word for the patient, what are the possible tests to perform and to ensure that the system will get this behavior correct. The admission of the patient is recorded correctly. And the administrator is informed that the ward to which the patient has been allocated. So we test these things. Have we got the information of the user correctly? Have we decided where the patient will be placed? And have we informed the right people that this patient will go to this ward? And you continue with the other tests for other use cases. You should be able to learn from these examples of how to build a use case, how to test a use case, produce test cases for different situations for every use case. Now, after performing all these activities on the hospital system, you have also another system which includes interviews, use cases, acceptance tests that can be also a reference for you to ensure and deepen your understanding for this phase of development, the requirements specification. So what you do after this is to go to the booklet, Unit 2 booklet, and have a look at the shopping system, where you will have a system domain given and use cases produced and acceptance test for use cases also there. You will find also constraints on the behaviors. So now you may need to depend on yourself to deepen your understanding and practice the information given in this unit. Thank you. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.